So today we are going to get started on a little bit more particularly talking about what it is that genes do. And to do that, we're going to also practice taking notes from a video. So I'm going to walk you through the lesson today. You are responsible for taking notes. And at the end, you will have 3 questions to answer in paragraph form. Let's dig in. So, we are going to start to talk about getting to know your genes. You may have noticed that in general people look like their parents. This is not always true, but there are some aspects that they share. Body type, hair texture, skin tone, the way their faces look. The study of this, the passage of traits, right? Remember, traits are physical characteristics from parents to children or offspring, is known as heredity. Although many children may resemble their parents, they are not copies. Some siblings look similar, some siblings look different. I'm sure you know some cases of people who look the same and people who don't. Right? Now, there are identical twins, and we talked a little bit about this, right? Where you have 2 people coming from one fertilized egg with exactly the same DNA, and they look fairly similar. But the question is, besides physical characteristics, besides physical traits, do they inherit any of the same personality traits? Well, there are researchers who study both physical and personality traits of identical twins.
Twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
Identical twins are a whole different story. These twins form from a single fertilized egg. Early on, the dividing egg splits into 2 identical embryos. The result is 2 human beings with the same DNA. Despite the shared genetics of identical twins, scientists have long thought that the similarities in personality and interests were the result of being raised in the same environment. But a 20-year research project is calling that long-held belief into question. Dr. Tom Bouchard of the University of Minnesota runs the largest ongoing study program of twins separated at birth in the world. To date, he has studied 78 sets of twins. Dr. Bouchard is conducting these studies to learn whether the similarities in personality among twins are determined by shared genetic traits, environment, or other factors. Twins in this study are also subjected to physical tests of strength and endurance. Similar physical responses to exercise suggest that strength and endurance are both genetic traits. However, the most groundbreaking part of the study is one that seeks to gauge the personality traits of twins. Responses to psychological tests have revealed that, in many cases, the personalities of identical twins are remarkably similar, whether the twins were raised together or not.
Certainly, as I was trained as a psychologist, your rearing environment, the kinds of parents you have, the child rearing patterns that they use, were very important determinants of your character, your personality, your vocational interests.
Dr. Bouchard's research suggests that the personalities of identical twins are determined more by their genetic inheritance than by the environment in which they were raised. But it's important not to jump to conclusions. Dr. Bouchard's study sample is quite small, so the results can't be applied to all sets of identical twins. Nonetheless, Bouchard's research raises questions about the role of upbringing and genes in a human being's development. As researchers continue to study identical twins, especially those separated at birth, they will gain new insight into the role genes play in determining each person's personality.
Now, this does not mean that everything about you is completely determined by your DNA. There are many differences that can arise because of your environment. For instance, your weight, your height, right? Things that require you to do something as you live. Fingerprints as well are different based on different environmental factors, right? So the genes do play a large part, but your environment is also responsible for this. And we will talk more about that later. But if we look, right, we have our questions down at the bottom. What do they kind of want to know if you already know about genes? Well, we should know that human body cells and sex cells are both cells in the body. They have some features that are the same. For instance, each contains pairs of chromosomes, and our body cells contain 46 chromosomes. Our sex cells, as we know, contain half as many, which is 23. As they both contain DNA, they both contain A's, T's, C's, and G's. We know that these body cells divide to produce identical cells. And we know that both contain genes. Let's see how well I did on that. That's right. Sex cells do not contain pairs of chromosomes. They contain a single chromosome from each parent. So even I make mistakes. We've talked about this. Children get 2 copies of each gene. Where do those copies come from? Is this not typing for me? There we go. And children come from their parents. I apologize, it's early in the morning. So we know that the genes in children come from their parents. They get 1 copy from each parent. Now, why do identical twins have the same physical characteristics where normal or more typical siblings are not completely identical? Identical twins have the same DNA. And I could submit that. What is the structure and function of genes? Now that is a big question, and rather than answer that, I'm going to wait and see what we can do about that on our quiz later. Explore. Continue announcing. So how are genes organized, right? We know that inside each and every cell on an organism there is DNA. The molecule contains a genetic code that determines physical traits, characteristics. This code is sometimes broken down into genes. Or not sometimes. This code is broken down into genes, each coding for its own trait. Some organisms have a single molecule of DNA called a chromosome in their cells, but most complex organisms have multiple chromosomes, like you with your 46. All chromosomes are made up of segments called genes, which code for particular proteins. The expression of proteins leads to traits like hair color, eye color, height, seed, shape, flower color. Don't just think of people, right? Everything has genes. You have thousands of genes that make up your chromosomes, and everyone's combination of chromosomes is slightly different. That's why humans are as diverse as they are, right? If we look here, we see a number of people that all look very different. This is a very staged shot, however. If we look here, we see flowers. Even flowers are different, even if they're the same species of flower. We will talk a little bit about albinism, because it's fun. And, yeah. So, the DNA molecules are very long. An adult human has 6 feet of DNA inside every cell. Since all genes are not making proteins all the time, right? You're not expressing all of your genes all the time. DNA condenses down to protect itself, to make it less vulnerable to being broken up. Each DNA molecule wraps itself around proteins to form a structure called chromatin. In non-dividing cells, DNA will stay in chromatin form. If the cells aren't, DNA is not doing anything, DNA stays as chromatin. When the cell is ready to divide and make 2 new cells, the chromatin will wrap around more protein molecules to form something called chromosomes. Those X-like structures we're used to. If you want to think about chromatin as looking like pasta, all clumped together and protected, whereas chromosomes are far more defined, very clear X's. While we call each molecule of DNA a chromosome, it's important to remember that true 6:30. It's important to remember that true chromosomes only form before cell division. Right? Chromosomes come in many sizes. Human chromosome 1, which is our largest chromosome, carries about 3,000 genes, where chromosome 21 only carries about 300.
The story goes that one day, shortly after Morgan started breeding Drosophila for his experiments, a striking mutant appeared in his lab. A fly with distinctive white eyes. He decided to breed it with a female fly that had ordinary red eyes, curious to see what the offspring would look like. 2 weeks later, he had his answer. One by one, the first generation offspring appeared. All of them had red eyes. Thinking that the white eyes might be a hidden characteristic similar to what Mendel had observed, Morgan waited to see what would happen in the second generation. Sure enough, the characteristic skipped a generation. This time, some of the flies had red eyes, and some had white eyes. But then Morgan saw something else. All of the flies with white eyes were male. At the time, it was known that the gender of a species is determined by two of the rod-shaped structures found in the cell nucleus, the chromosomes. For example, human females have 2 X chromosomes. Human males have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Morgan realized that the gene responsible for the white eyes must somehow be associated with the fact that male flies have only 1 X chromosome.
So this is where we get into things that are a little more complicated. We start to realize at this point in history that chromosomes have particular genes on them, and as a result, certain traits tend to pass with other traits because their genes are located on the same chromosome. This is a very complicated process. I will definitely explain this more and more, but let's take a minute and see how genes actually separate.
Synapsis only occurs in meiosis and does not take place during mitosis. It is during synapsis that an important process called crossing over occurs, in which a random exchange of chromosomal material takes place between the maternal and paternal homologous chromosomes. This key event is one of the main things that produces genetic diversity among different offspring of the same parent.
So, what on earth does all of that mean? So, in our previous video, we talked about how genes come from each parent, and certain traits move together, right? So, you may have both your dad's hair and your dad's hair texture, right? The way your hair is seems the same as your father. Now, this can go generation to generation. Just because things are on the same chromosome, however, doesn't mean that you necessarily have siblings that have the same traits. This does a horrible job of explaining that, though. We will talk about this more in class. Now, don't think number of chromosomes equals more complicated living thing. Different species have different number of chromosomes. A fruit fly, tiny little fly, has 8 chromosomes. But a plum that you might eat has 48 rather. A crab has 208. You have 46. You have less chromosomes than a plum. While there's variety among species, each organism within a species has the exact same number of chromosomes in every cell in your body. One comes from each parent, no matter what it is. And since each chromosome holds a specific number of genes, that lets each person or living thing, as long as their chromosomes are this typical shape.